The concept of six great civilizations preceding our own is frequently traced to ancient Mesopotamian records. When I examine the primary cuneiform sources, however, I encounter an immediate structural problem. The texts themselves do not explicitly make this declaration. Instead, this numerical framework appears to be an interpretive byproduct. It emerges from the specific architectural choices Sumerian scribes made when organizing their dynastic lists, particularly how they segmented long periods of rule before a mythological flood. This creates a fundamental methodological tension. Are we observing a deliberate record of sequential worlds, or are we projecting a modern framework onto an ancient system of political legitimation? The distinction is critical for any responsible analysis. My investigation must therefore separate the text's internal architecture from the external interpretations imposed upon it. The central question shifts from what the lists record to how their structure functions to organize the past for a contemporary Mesopotamian audience. Before I can even approach the content of these successions, I must first map the logic of the container itself. The primary objective is to understand the scribal intent behind these divisions, which is the necessary first step to resolving the central interpretive conflict. My investigation is anchored in the concept of 7 divisions, a framework often used to periodize early Sumerian history. This structure provides the initial point of entry for analyzing how Mesopotamian scribes conceived of their own deep past and organized its narrative sequence. The primary textual source for this analysis is the Sumerian king list, specifically its most comprehensive recensions. I am treating this document not as a simple chronicle, but as a deliberately constructed artifact whose architecture is itself a form of data for my investigation. To ground this inquiry, I focus on specific cuneiform tablets that preserve this tradition. The Weld Blundell prism, housed in the Ashmolean Museum, offers one of the most complete versions of the list, making it an essential reference point for establishing a baseline structure. However, this is not a monolithic record. My supporting data is drawn from various fragmentary king lists unearthed at the ancient site of Nippur. These fragments are critical because they often present variant readings and different organizational choices, complicating any simple interpretation. When I compare the Nippur material to the more standard recensions, I observe subtle but significant differences in the grouping of rulers and the lengths of their reigns. This immediately forces a methodological question. Which structure represents the intended scribal framework? The core of my work, therefore, involves mapping how these records structure the successions of kingship. I am tracing the formal divisions the scribes themselves created to segment long spans of time and shifts in political power from one city-state to another. A crucial feature of this architecture is the clear delineation of periods that precede a mythological great flood. This event functions as a major chronological caesura within the text, a clean break that separates one era of history from what comes after it. Before I can address the meaning of these divisions, my immediate task is to deconstruct their formal properties. I must first understand the logic of the container itself, the scribal system of periodization, before I can responsibly analyze the historical or cosmological contents it holds. When I directly examine the primary cuneiform sources, the idea of 6 preceding civilizations is not stated as a historical fact. I find no such explicit declaration in the text of the Sumerian king list or its variants. The number itself appears to be absent from any direct summary statement. Instead, this numerical framework seems to be an emergent property. It appears to arise from the specific architectural choices the Sumerian scribes made when they structured the dynastic successions. The very act of dividing the past into discrete blocks creates this interpretive possibility. One of the most prominent features I observe is the extraordinary duration of the reigns recorded for the earliest kings. For instance, the first king of Eridu, Alulim, is listed with a reign of 28,800 years. This is a consistent structural element of the antediluvian section. Another fundamental organizational principle is the documented transfer of kingship between dominant urban centers. The text explicitly states when one city's hegemony ends and another's begins, such as the transfer of rule from Eridu to Bad Tabira after 2 kings had reigned. The narrative is also punctuated by specific large-scale chronological ruptures. These events function as formal dividers that segment distinct historical periods from one another. The most significant of these is, of course, the great flood that swept over the land. This flood event serves as the primary caesura in the entire king list tradition. It cleanly separates the 8 antediluvian kings, with their impossibly long reigns, from all subsequent post-diluvian dynasties, which begin with the first dynasty of Kish. The scribal formula for these transitions is highly regularized. Phrases like, "Then city A was smitten with weapons, its kingship to city B was carried," mark the end of one hegemonic block and the beginning of the next, creating a clear, segmented sequence. This structure generates an ordered succession of past eras. Each era is defined by a ruling city and its dynastic line, creating a chain of legitimacy that stretches from a remote mythological past into the historical period of the scribe who compiled the list. The text therefore presents a formal sequence of political hegemonies. It begins with Eridu, moves through Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak before the flood, and then resumes with Kish. This is the observable architecture of the document. What results is a documented sequence of past ages that logically precedes the era the scribes identified as their own contemporary stage. The internal logic of the text organizes the past into a series of distinct sequential chapters, each with a clear beginning and end. To identify the underlying logic here, my method involves a direct comparative analysis. I'm setting the early fragmentary versions of the king lists, such as those from Nippur, against the more complete and standardized later recensions like the Weld-Blundell prism. When I perform this cross-textual examination, a recurring functional pattern becomes immediately apparent. The scribal organization isn't arbitrary. Each major division of the pre-flood and early post-flood record concludes with a significant, formally declared structural transition. This isn't a subtle feature, it is the primary architectural principle of the document. The end of each hegemonic cycle is explicitly marked. A clear boundary is drawn before the next cycle begins, creating a series of discrete, self-contained historical blocks. I can categorize these transitions into 2 main types. The first is political displacement, captured in the formulaic phrase indicating a city was smitten with weapons and its kingship carried to a new center. This marks a violent but orderly transfer of power. The second type of transition is a singular, cataclysmic event that affects the entire recorded world. The Great Flood is the most prominent example, functioning as an absolute caesura that resets the very conditions of kingship and human history as presented in the text. The narrative function of such a concluding event appears to be consistent. It serves to formally reset and redefine the continuity of the historical record. Each rupture acts as a clean slate, terminating one sequence of rule before another can be established. This creates a clear, irreversible linearity. The past is not presented as a continuous flow, but as a chain of distinct epochs. Each epoch is defined by its ruling city, its kings, and is terminated by a definitive event that punctuates the timeline. What emerges from this structure is a sequence of 6 distinct hegemonic blocks preceding the era of the scribes who compiled the most complete lists. I count 5 antediluvian cities, Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak, plus the first post-diluvian dynasty of Kish. This sequence is what gives rise to the interpretive possibility of preceding worlds. The architecture of the list itself, with its 6 sequential chapters closed by rupture, logically invites a numerical reading of the past. The idea of a 7th civilization therefore appears to function as a potential reading of this scribal sequence, not as an established ontological claim made by the text itself. It is a byproduct of the document's formal structure, an interpretation enabled by its very design. However, a significant misalignment emerges when I place this observed textual structure against its common external interpretations. The clear 6-part accounting system I have mapped does not sit comfortably with the narrative often built upon it. The contemporary tendency is to transform this organizational schema into a categorical assertion about 6 sequential, distinct past worlds. Each hegemonic block is treated as a self-contained civilization that rises and then vanishes, succeeded by the next. This reading, however, projects a modern, almost cyclical framework onto a document whose internal logic suggests a fundamentally different purpose. The Sumerian scribes were not necessarily chronicling global cycles. They appear to be managing a political concept. When I re-examine the transitions, a critical detail comes into focus. The text does not describe the end of kingship itself, only its relocation. After the flood, kingship, or Nam Lugal, is said to have descended from heaven once again, implying a continuity of the institution. This suggests that Nam Lugal is treated as a singular mobile entity. It is an abstract principle of order that can be hosted by different cities but is never itself destroyed. This subtle point directly conflicts with the notion of completely separate, terminated worlds. The political ruptures also present a problem for this interpretation. When Eridu's kingship is carried to Bad Tibira, the text is describing a transfer of power, not the end of Sumerian culture. These are shifts in hegemony within a persistent cultural landscape. A further deep conflict arises when I attempt to align this sequence with the archaeological record. The cities mentioned, like Eridu and Kish, were part of a continuous Mesopotamian material culture. There is no evidence for 6 discrete civilizational layers separated by cataclysms. This forces a critical re-evaluation of the scribal intent. If the structure does not map onto archaeological reality or a cosmology of separate worlds, then its function must lie elsewhere. The architecture itself seems to be the primary message. What I may be observing is not a historical or cosmological record, but a tool for political legitimation. The structure serves to create a single, unbroken chain of authority stretching from a mythical origin point to the contemporary ruler for whom the list was compiled. The tension, therefore, is between a modern reading that seeks discrete, sequential civilizations and a scribal practice that appears to emphasize a singular, continuous institution of rule. We are looking for endings, while the text seems to be constructing an unending line. This misalignment generates the central question for the next phase of my investigation. Is the segmentation of the past into 6 blocks meant to highlight rupture and replacement, or is it a rhetorical device to organize and legitimize an unbroken succession of power? My analysis must therefore pivot. I need to move from simply counting the structural divisions to decoding their political and ideological function within the Mesopotamian world that produced them. The problem is no longer what the list says, but what it was designed to do. This forces a fundamental shift in my analytical approach. The central question is no longer what the Sumerian king list says, but what it does. I must now examine the memorial function of these numerical divisions within the broader context of the entire Sumerian literary corpus. When I consider this wider literary landscape, the partitioning of the past into 6 prior stages begins to look less like a historical record and more like a carefully constructed framework. Its primary purpose may have been to preserve a specific lineage and confer dynastic legitimacy upon subsequent rulers. This political function appears far more central to the text's design than any attempt at an empirical description of technologically distinct societies. The scribes were not cataloguing different worlds, they seem to have been building a foundation for their own. The dominant axis of the document, therefore, remains documentary. The numbering I observe derives from how these scribes organize the past to achieve specific political ends in their present. The structure serves a contemporary purpose, not a purely archival one. What this suggests is that the sequence is not based on independent verification of global civilizational cycles. Instead, it appears to be a product of the internal narrative and structural requirements of a political project. The form follows function. This growing tension between the text's internal architecture and its common external reading establishes the primary investigative path for my analysis. The conflict is not in the data itself, but in the assumptions we bring to it. My research must now pivot to track how an idea like the 7th civilization is sustained, reconfigured, or even contradicted by the text's own internal logic. I have to analyze the interaction between the structure and the interpretation it enables. The question is no longer whether there were 6 preceding worlds. The more precise methodological question is, how does this specific 6-part architecture function as a rhetorical and political tool to organize the deep past for a Mesopotamian audience? This forces me to treat the king list not as a window into a lost history, but as a technology of power. I need to decode its operational logic as an instrument designed to create a very specific understanding of continuity and authority. If this structure is indeed a mechanism for legitimation, then my next task is to identify the specific political pressures or historical circumstances that would necessitate the creation of such a profound and elaborate chronological framework. The text's purpose now becomes the central mystery. My investigation is now forced to return to the Sumerian king list, but with a fundamentally altered perspective. I began by analyzing it as a potential chronicle, then as a political instrument. Now, I must treat it as a conceptual object whose very design encodes a specific worldview. The problem is no longer simply the function of its six-part structure, but the logic behind the choice of that structure. If it is a tool for legitimation, why this particular design? Why organize the past into these specific blocks, marked by such dramatic, almost mythological ruptures? The antediluvian rains, with their extraordinary durations, re-emerge as the central anomaly. These numbers are not just simple exaggerations, they appear to be components of a highly structured, perhaps even mathematical system for conceptualizing deep time. Their scale seems to defy political utility alone. This suggests that the six-part division and the numerology of the rains may be two integrated parts of the same conceptual apparatus. What I initially treated as a political framework for organizing history may in fact be a historical framework for organizing a much larger cosmological idea. This possibility forces a methodological shift away from treating the list as a purely historical or political document. It may be that the text operates on a different understanding of temporality itself, one where dynastic succession is merely the narrative vehicle for a deeper structure. The central inquiry therefore transforms. Is the king list a record of human succession, or is it a cosmological model that uses the language of kingship to articulate the flow of cosmic time? This moves the analysis from the realm of political history to the history of ideas. To even approach this question, I can no longer confine my analysis to the king lists alone. I must now place their temporal framework alongside other Mesopotamian texts that structure reality, such as creation myths and astronomical diaries, to search for a shared conceptual logic. The investigation is therefore no longer about a sequence of past worlds. The question that now guides my work is far more fundamental. What if this document is not merely organizing history, but is instead mapping the very architecture of time itself?